The No BS Spiritual Book Club, the only no BS guide to the best spiritual books to inspire your own journey of self-discovery. Here's your host, founder of the No BS Spiritual Book Club, Sandie Sedgbeer.
Hello. There are some people who don't just talk about peace. They live it, breathe it, and quietly build it in the most unlikely places. Today's guest is one of them, a former diplomat who spent decades bridging worlds, from Catholic seminaries to Sufi circles, from courtrooms to war zones, and from bureaucratic negotiation tables to the silent rituals of inner peace. Michael Macy has walked with mystics, worked in conflict zones, and now invites people everywhere to enact peace in their own lives. Michael Macy joins me now to share the 10 books that shaped his extraordinary journey from serving governments to serving the heart. Michael Macy, welcome.
Thanks, Sandy. I don't know if I recognize the person you described, but
thanks, I do.
Thanks very much.
So tell me about the criteria you used to come up with these 10 books.
There were some of them that were quite easy. I mean, I'm very aware that they were books that changed my life in that they either changed my perspective or they led directly to me making more dramatic changes. And then there were some I had to just sit and think about and think back at various points in my life at what were the books that influenced me the most. And part of it was looking at my bookshelves, since I have many of these books. Actually, some of them are just behind me.
You said that some of the books were in a case or a trunk that your parents put aside for you when you left home at 14. What were you doing leaving home at 14, and why did your parents choose these books to put aside for you?
I don't really know why they chose the books. I left home to go to Catholic seminary at 14. I don't really know, though the one book that I do mention that did come out of the things my parents set aside for me certainly was a Catholic book. And so it wouldn't have surprised me if for some reason my mother saved that book for me.
Well, there's the first book that we're going to talk about. The first book on your list is one that you say changed your life when you first read it at the age of 12. And it is Mr. Blue by Miles Connolly, published in 1928. Tell us how that book came to you at the age of 12 and about the impact it had.
Well, I was going to Catholic primary school and was chosen for a group of students that the classroom teacher wanted to work with and give particular books for discussion. And one of the first books was Mr. Blue. I don't know if anybody reads it anymore. I hope that they do. But the influence, it was magic. It is the story of this young man who really is infused with the divine spirit in a very real way, in a way that made him do what I think most of us would think as foolish things, but with great insight. And it challenged a lot of the ways that I had seen religion. It challenges sort of a belief in dogma. It challenges also other values, the value of things, or even necessarily the value of working hard. And I just remember reading it going, what an amazing life.
So what was it about the story of the Holy Fool that hooked you so young? And what is the Holy Fool?
Well, I'm not sure that I recognized the protagonist as a holy fool at the time, but there are throughout folklore, and as I learned, there are people who really are holy fools. They're so moved by the experience of the spirit that to the rest of us, they do very silly things, but they're joyful and they're celebratory. And they move through life with a childlike innocence without being naive.
Yeah, I love that when people seem to retain that childlike innocence. I mean, we're so quick to lose it, aren't we?
Yeah, we're encouraged to lose it early, unfortunately.
Yeah.
But then there are those, as the character in this book, who retains it. And the Holy Fool, I mean, part of the Holy Fool, and there are different forms, but they're always allowed to speak the truth. I mean, they were the people who could speak to the king without losing their head, the fool.
Yes.
In India or in South Asia and other areas influenced certainly by the Sufis, they're the Madzub, those who are just aflame with the love of God, and they're often avoided because they can only speak the truth. Well, I'm not sure that we all want to hear it.
No, we don't, do we?
I mean, I have stories about them too, but yeah, so there are those, I think they're rare, but they're worth finding if one looks, those fools for the divine.
So book number 2 is Legends of the Hasidim, Introduction to Hasidic Culture and Oral Tradition in the New World by Jerome R. Mintz, published in 1968. And you said this book was the introduction to what you believe is the reality of magic.
The Hasidim. Yeah, I love that book. It introduced me to a number of things. One is the role of dance in worship, in ecstatic dance. Now, I later encountered that in different ways, certainly the whirling of the dervishes, but that was my first introduction. And also, there are many of the stories of that tradition that are stories of magic, and yet they're told with such simplicity, but also clarity that one believes them. At least I did. I still do. I mean, I believe my own life has provided me with examples of the real but inexplicable. And now that's pretty easy for me. I don't know how electricity works. So most of my life is surrounded by magic. But on other levels, there are things we don't understand but are very real and which can be celebrated. And in that, and also the power of stories. I mean, that book really introduced me to the power of stories. In fact, there's one particular story that really exemplifies the power of stories. So that book really had and then that book encouraged me to go out and look for these people. I mean, one of the things my father had once told me is that it cannot be that there were only people like the apostles, because he thought in Christian terms at one time, there must be people like that who are alive today. And then this book introduced me to another world of sacred dance and storytelling and just joy. I mean, the ecstatic celebration of the Hasidim are like, in a way, the whirling of the dervishes. There is that great ecstasy.
How did that start?
I'm sorry?
How did that start, the whirling of the dervishes?
Well, the story is that, I don't know if you know the story of Jalaluddin Rumi, whose life was changed when he met Shams Tabriz. And that transfixed him and transformed his life. He exploded into the divine experience. When Shams left, and it is assumed that Shams was killed by Rumi's sons, when he disappeared, Rumi was so heartbroken that the only way he could heal his heart was through the whirling, through that sense of ecstasy that it induces. At least that's one of the stories it's a powerful practice.
Yeah, I mean, I've seen people doing it and it's astonishing. I remember reading a book once by Linda Goodman, the astrologer of the 80s that everyone paid attention to. And she talked about whirling and spinning. And she said, if you do it every day and you do it anti-clockwise, you can hold back the years. So I tried it for a few weeks.
Oh, good.
Didn't work, at least not in a few weeks. But yes, I'm sure it's you have to be completely somewhere else. Yeah.
And it's not emotion. And that was one of the powerful lessons for me the first time that I did it. I just stopped and was standing, just tears were running down my face. I was just, and a good friend of mine came up and he put his arms around me. He was a very powerful person, not just personality, but beyond personality. He said, remember, this has nothing to do with emotion. And I knew what he meant because it ran much deeper than.
Book number 3 is a guidebook that you've returned to for over 45 years. The Complete Sayings of Hazrat Inayat Khan, published in 1978. Why? What does it hold for you?
Well, I left the Catholic seminary and then eventually left the Catholic congregation because my sense was that all of the various faiths of the world couldn't be wrong. That it just didn't make sense. There were too many brilliant people and sincere people. And I kept looking for a teaching, a path that sort of honored all of those traditions. And that was what I found in the teachings of Murshid Hazrat Inayat Khan, who, and I'm paraphrasing, but he said, they're not the same, these traditions, but they're harmonious. And he was a great musician. He said, like the notes or the chords on a piano, they're not the same, but they are harmonious. And that really resonated with me. It was that deep respect for all of the world's faiths in a way that I could understand, in a way that was inviting. And I still go back to his books, particularly that book, because one of it's short phrases. It's not a long, in-depth theological discussion. It is just those sharp, bright moments. So yeah, I go back to and that's a sort of encapsulation of his teachings in one book. There are many. There are actually 14 volumes in the Message series and other things written since he passed, but that's a great condensed.
Is there
collection.
one particular aphorism that still stops you in your tracks?
Is there still one what?
Aphorism that still stops you in your tracks?
Well, it comes and goes, but the one that I keep remembering now is the first step to forgiveness is forgetfulness. Because I think so much of what we're experiencing now is inherited trauma. It's not even the trauma. And until we can forget, we won't forgive. And there's in my opinion, way too much emphasis on remembering.
Yes. And it's true. And most people say, I can forgive, but I can't forget. So they haven't.
Well, you can't. I don't think you can do one without the other.
Yeah. Yeah. That's very true. Book number 4, you've carried across continents, and you've even read it from it on Maltese television. The Essential Rumi, transliterated with Coleman Barks, John Moyne, A.J. Arbery, Reynold Nicholson, published in 1995. And you know Coleman Barks.
I do.
You do?
He's a good friend. I first tried to read Rumi in the Victorian translations, and it just didn't make any sense to me. I mean, after I had been initiated into the sort of esoteric school, into learning about Sufism, everybody talked about Rumi, so it just didn't make much sense to me. And then when I was in graduate school, a friend of mine, a fellow student who was a friend of Coleman's, said, well, try these. And he had what were copies of Coleman's manuscripts. He hadn't printed any books yet. He hadn't published any books yet. He was a professor of English literature and poetry at the University of Georgia. And they just sang. I mean, and again, it wasn't a book. It was, I think I have those pages somewhere. So as the books came out, probably the first one I got was The Essential Rumi, and I loved it. I would read it out loud to myself. I would read it to anybody who would listen. I would read it quietly to myself. And then eventually I met Coleman. He contacted me when I was working in Afghanistan and said, I'd like to come to Afghanistan. Would you sponsor it? And I was in a position where I had funding for cultural exchanges. So I said, sure. And then he and I wandered around Afghanistan for a while, including his reading in the ruins of the madrasa of Rumi's father and Balkh, which was an amazing experience. Balkh was destroyed by Genghis Khan. It's just this plain of a ruined city, but they know where the madrasa was. So it was just Coleman and I think two guys that were with us. And then since then, I've been with him in India and I've been with him here and still stay in touch with him. But he has that sensibility because for many years he was a student himself of a Sufi teacher. And I think that's you have to have that insight. It's not literal translation. I know he's often criticized, that's not exactly what Rumi said. And I would say, well, works for me.
Rumi comes up quite a bit on this show, and in people's 10 best lists, and Coleman Barks is usually associated with that. So I hear his name a lot. So what does Rumi's voice awaken in you that other mystics don't?
I think it is certainly, and it's really his love for people, for the words that are able to communicate that love, for his experience of the depth behind the words, and his ability with words. I mean, he is a poet. He's a poet in his own right. And I think only poets understand the creation, the writing of poetry. All of the rest of us can appreciate it and be touched by it. But it takes a poet to write poetry. Oh, that sounds redundant, but he is a poet. And also there is a real sense of humility. He knows he's not writing this, that he is but path through which the transmission is communicated. And he takes that role very seriously, but with great humility. It's never about Coleman. And he's a good man to travel with. He's a lot of fun.
Is he?
We went to a great Buzkashi match, which is the national sport of Afghanistan. And it's basically polo with a goat's carcass. And it's the most incredible sport. It makes rugby and American football look like badminton. It's nuts. It's unlimited men on horse beating each other and horses trained to fight. It's crazy. And we were close enough. We had a horse sweat, And I remember Coleman got up to walk out and he said, there's so much testosterone here right now. I just feel like hitting somebody in his deep Georgia accent. I knew what he meant. I mean, he would never do it, but it was just, so he's a great person to travel with.
Excuse me. So book number 5, Tales of the Dervishes by Idris Shah, published in 1967.
Well, there are lots of collections of stories by Idris Shah. I'm sure I'm not the first person to mention one of them. Mm-hmm. For me, that was really an early introduction. I think his Learning How to Learn. I'd read a review of it in Psychology Today, and that didn't resonate that much with me, but Tales of the Dervishes did. And I still go back to that book. In fact, I recently gave a friend of mine a copy of it because there are some things you can only say with stories. And that's certainly a teaching technique of the Sufis and of the Hasids. And it's in a lot of traditions, but certainly in Christianity. And there are stories in that book which to me are the best exemplars of particular points. So I go back to it a lot. I refer to a lot, and I retell some of those stories. It's given me a vocabulary to attempt to explain the inexplicable.
Is there one story in particular that helped you at a particular turning point in your life?
There's a number of them, but one of them is the story of this dervish and the poor patched robes. They didn't care. They don't care about stuff. He shows up And the Caliph in I think Baghdad or wherever said, well, I've heard dervishes know the secrets of everything. You must stay in my court and teach me. So this dervish moves into the court and he hangs around and he eats regularly and he sleeps in a comfortable bed, but he never teaches anything. And he just hangs out. And the Caliph's starting to get a little irritated. And then one of his courtiers comes and said, the greatest vocalist in the world has moved into the city. And the Caliph said, I must command a performance. If this person has the most beautiful voice in the world, they must sing for me. So the courtiers, they all go out and they all come back. He said he refuses. I said, how can he refuse? I'm the ruler of the world. I'm this and that. And the dervish says, well, I can make him do it. And the Caliph goes, you've done nothing but sit there and eat my food for months. You just sat around. How are you going to do this when none of my, the barons, the dukes, the great powers of my court can't? And he said, just do what I tell you, and he will perform. Oh, says, okay. The dervish says, dress in rags and follow me. So they're wandering the streets. The Caliph doesn't know what's going on. He doesn't know where they are. And all of a sudden the dervish stops and he sings. And he sings this beautiful song. But the Caliph didn't recognize it, but he sang one note wrong. And the balcony above them opens and this person steps out and sings the song perfectly, note for note. And the Caliph goes, how did you know how to do that? And he said, everything requires the right people in the right place at the right time.
Yeah, there you go. That's a huge lesson. Yeah. So book number 6 literally changed your life, sent you off to San Francisco to find the Sufis. And it is In the Garden with Murshid Sam, a compendium of stories, biographical elements to writings. And this is a compendium of stories about Samuel Lewis, with whom I'm not familiar, published in 1975.
Sam. I was just talking about him the other day with one of his students. He was certainly one of the great American mystics of the 20th century. He was a good friend and inspiration for Paul Reps, who introduced Zen Buddhism into Sam Lewis started a Christian order. He was recognized as a Hasidic Reb. He was recognized as a Hindu Swami. He was incredibly well-versed in Buddhism. But he once wrote, all of the great teachers have appeared to me, but Muhammad appeared twice, so I figured I was a Sufi. And he had been a student of Hazrat Inayat Khan's in the early part of the 20th century. And I didn't know anything about him. I stumbled across this book in a remainder bin where I was sort of kind of picking through them because I didn't have any money. And for some reason, it struck me. So I bought it and I read it, and there were a couple of things that one was a picture of Hazrat Inayat Khan, and I don't know if I'd seen pictures of him before, but that picture just affected me. And then there are just wonderful stories about this man who was very American. His father had been a vice president at Levi Strauss, Levi's. He was very American, but also seemed to have been this amazing person. He was a gardener. He was awarded by the U.S. government during World War II, and no one's really exactly sure what he was doing, though I'm sure it was esoteric. He was, by all accounts, certainly by the accounts of the people who talk about him in that book, amazing. In that book was a picture of him with Allen Ginsberg, the poet. And in those days, I hung out with friends of mine who were poets, and one of them was a good friend of Allen Ginsberg, and he invited him to come and read at the local university. This is really the middle of, I won't say the middle of nowhere, it's where people live, but it's not known. And I met Allen Ginsberg because I was a friend of the host and hung out with him. And I asked him, I said, did you know Sam Lewis? He said, yeah, he was the real thing. He said, there are a lot of people who claims are made about them or they make claims about themselves, but he was real. He said, you should go study with his students. And Murshid Sam had died a couple of years before. So I thought about it, not even that long, and I thought, well, this is advice from someone who I respect, and I had in getting to know him. I really did respect him. I learned a lot from him. There are 2 major decisions in my life made on his advice, and so I quit my job, and as one did in those days, bought a van, and San Francisco seemed to be the place because that's where Sam Lewis had lived. And I probably didn't have to go that far, but when you're on a quest, there's got to be some trials and travails. I don't think it should be easy, and I think everybody should go on a quest and a pilgrimage, and they're different. So yeah, that book changed my life.
What was the second piece of advice he gave you?
Oh, I ran into him again. And we were talking, and he said, you should work for peace in the Holy Land. He said, you should get American Sufis to work for peace and get the Jewish poets. Well, a number of years later, I was invited to join this group that was started by one of my Sufi teachers. And actually that was inspired by Murshid Sam, who was very concerned about peace in Israel and Palestine and set up a mechanism to promote it, and wrote one of the most amazing epic poems I've ever read called the Jerusalem Trilogy. It's a beautiful epic. So we're right back to Sam Lewis. People should look for him. You can find videos of him. I mean, he is, there are some books about it, but he really probably had more of an influence on certainly mysticism than maybe anybody else in the U.S. without being known. He also initiated what are called the dances of universal peace, which again comes back to the use of what I would call movement and meditation. They're not folk dances. They're very powerful. And each one is based on one of the world's religious traditions.
I'll check him out. Book number 7. You call this a great celebration of the human spirit. It is The Grapes of Wrath by John Steinbeck, published in 1939. Why is it the great celebration of the human spirit?
I think because it's a simple story of humble people faced with difficult times. And they don't always do the right thing, but they do what's right. And it shows how one can dissolve oneself in the world to be of service. I mean, when I've talked to young people, I don't encourage them to go out and find themselves. I always encourage them to go out and lose themselves. And in a sense, that's what the principle in the book does. That's the end. And to get there is the in many ways dramatic facing the challenges of life, which we're all invited to do. Sometimes it's more dramatic than others. And Steinbeck writes beautifully. Also, for me, the first sort of one of the great explorations of my life is I wanted to understand American culture. So I spent years sort of wandering around, doing whatever I thought would give me some insight, and reading what I thought would portray different aspects of American culture. I want to know where I live. And Steinbeck was certainly, and that book particularly, I think, provided a real view of what I think is who we are at our best, which is community-minded, generous, naive, sometimes foolish, but willing to get on with it. Whatever it takes, we'll deal with it. But so, yeah, I think I used to try to read that book every year. I don't do it anymore.
Do you remember how old you were when you read it first time?
I want to say 16 or 17, but I'm really not sure, because that would have been the time I think I started reading Steinbeck. Though I know when I lived in California, I went back and read a lot more because I was there and it was where he was from. And it was Steinbeck country in a way, Monterey and Carmel and the places that he'd written about in Cannery Row.
Yeah. So book number 8, The Lost Universe Pawnee Life and Culture by Jean Weltfish, 1965. This seems a strange one to have in the middle of your list.
It is, but it's a book that had a huge influence, and I've never finished it. It's an anthropological study. This is not a page turner. This is a hard slog. And Jean Weltfish was an incredible anthropologist, particularly for her time. She used Jean with the male spelling. I think by all accounts, she was a force of nature. And I first was introduced to that book when I was 18 in a course I took, and I carried it around for years without ever reading all that much of it. But what I did read really affected me because it gave me a window into another view of the world. Now, I've since learned more about, and they vary, but the indigenous the nations of the U.S. But the Pawnee, in that book, she's able to capture somewhat the perspective, which is very different than what I was familiar with. And one of the things that struck me was how they raised their children. For example, the parents didn't discipline the children. The maternal uncles disciplined the children. So that freed up the parents to have more of an emotional, more playful experience or relationship with the children. It wasn't that they didn't get any discipline. It's just that the parents didn't do it.
Yes.
And that there was a much broader sense that children can't learn everything from their parents. They need to be exposed in very real ways to other people so that they can find people who can guide them with the gifts that they have, because their parents may not even recognize or understand the gifts your children have. Mm-hmm. So what I've tried to do, and I make no claim as to being a particularly good parent, as my daughters would probably agree, but I did make an effort so that they were introduced to people who became figures in their life much more important than just friends of their parents. And that's true to this day. And sometimes, in some ways, they're closer to some of those people than they might be to me, but that's okay. Because I really think the challenge is life is knowing what is ours to do. Or as Pir Vilayat said, if we would be who we could be if we were who we really are. And that takes interaction with other people to find out what resonates, to find out what strikes that chord, which awakens that joy, or as Joseph Campbell said, that bliss. And Hazrat Inayat Khan also talked about bliss before Joseph Campbell.
Yeah, I think, mentors are so important. And I look back on my life, and now I regret that I didn't understand the fullness of what they were giving me at the time. But boy, do I treasure those people who are long gone now. But yeah, and I never would have learned some of the things that set me on my path without them.
Yeah, I think one of the sad things is that we don't respect wisdom. And in my experience, generally, the people I've met who I would consider wise were older. It's not a prerequisite, but it's often a factor. And if we don't look for people who are wise, we certainly don't find them. And if we don't expect to develop, if we don't aspire to developing wisdom, then no one does. And there are fewer wise people around for younger people to look for. And I think that's one of the tragedies in our modern culture, is that we don't respect and we don't recognize wisdom, and we don't expect or hope to become wise. And so it's becomes even more difficult. But yeah, I'm incredibly grateful to those people who gave me lessons in what it meant to be wise.
Yeah. Book number 9, I was really pleased to see this on your list. It's come up a few times for me. And of all of the books that, I make notes, I must read that one, I must read that one, I must read that one. This is the one, my top must read. Being and Vibration by Beautiful Painted Arrow, Joseph Rael, published in 1992. And I've been hearing a lot about him, and I just wish I'd had the privilege of meeting him.
So do I. This is one of my regrets, because I could have. I moved in the same circles he did at one point in my life. And I've heard him on the phone once. And I was in the Southwest 2 years ago and tried to meet with him, but his wife's a tough gatekeeper. No one's getting to him these days because he's quite elderly. But I was introduced to him through my teacher, Shahabuddin Les, who was his and is his student. I mean, Beautiful Painted Arrow is still alive. Yeah, that book, that one I've read more recently, I would say within the last 3 to 4 years. And I keep going back to it. And it's one of those books which is challenging because I don't understand it, but I know that it's true. And I'm particularly struck by there's a part where he talks about moving to his father's pueblo, his father's family. I can't remember which of the pueblos in the Southwest, and his mother's was Eastern Cheyenne, I think, but it's moving to his grandparents in the pueblo. That was a major moment where he has to learn the language of the pueblo, and in that language there are no nouns, which just I can't imagine it. I mean, I can. Everything is in motion, as the physics tell us. But that's a language that recognizes it and knows it. In fact, I was having a conversation about this last week with one of the teachers of the Brahma Kumaris, and Sister Maureen was saying, yes, she's run into that in other places where they talk about those languages, which are just vibrant, for lack of a better word, that just experience life as motion. And it's just amazing. But there are many other great insights from that book. And again, he's alive, and you can watch him on video. He's great. One of my favorite scenes is he's in the garden and he's singing to his squash, because he said you have to sing to them to encourage them to grow. And he said, and squash want to be eaten. That's what they live for. That they're there to provide us nutrition. And so celebrate that with the squash. Be grateful to the squash that they share themselves with us so that we might live.
And they become part of us.
And they become part of us, absolutely.
Yeah. So how do you live with the mystery without rushing to solve it?
Without what?
Rushing to solve it. I mean, I don't know that I could cope with that. There's nothing worse than not knowing.
I think part of it is moving around a lot, which I have. And I often would move to places where I couldn't read the street signs because I didn't know the language. So at one point, I just realized I'm never going to know where I am. And that's okay. And that was, I kind of remember that moment. Part of it was I was trying to, these things come out of, I'm a pretty mundane person, but I was trying to buy ice for a party in Malta. I went to the place I'd bought the drinks and I said, I want to buy ice. They said, oh, we don't sell ice. I said, okay. So I walked across the street to the grocery store, this little grocery store, and I said, I'd like to buy ice. So we don't sell ice. And then I realized, no, I have to give up. I have to accept I don't know. So I said, okay, where do I buy ice? They said the truck rental place. Now, I would not have figured that out on my own. And then I realized there are so many things I don't know and I'm never going to know that I should just give it up. You know, the big lesson for me was I'm never going to know where I am. And that's okay. And then it was a really liberating insight, because then wherever I am, I'm home, because there's no place I'm going to know more than where I happen to be at this moment. There's no place I can go to that's going to be any more familiar, because any place I used to be has changed since I left it. So it's not the same place anyway. So what's the point? You know? So I don't, Sandie, I don't care about the mysteries. I just want to enjoy the curiosity and the joy, and realizing that so much of that joy just comes from often misguided but attempts at being some kind of service.
Mm-hmm. Well, I envy you, Michael, because, I'm a Gemini and our favourite word is why. And I always used to drive myself crazy as a child because I couldn't bear the thought that one day I'm going to die and I'm not going to have all the answers. I've kind of tamped that one down a little bit, but I still want to know more than I can possibly know.
Well, I think the other thing is that I've accepted that I can learn things that I don't know, but all that does is amplify my understanding of how much I don't know.
Yeah.
It's like peeling the onion or gazing out into the galaxies, It's just, that was in fact, about a year or so ago, maybe longer, one of my teachers said, okay, just accept, just give up everything you think you learned, start over. I said, oh, okay. I mean, I didn't say okay quite as accepting as that, but I understood what he meant. And then, because every day you start over. Yeah. And there are new insights to be gained. And what a joy, what a gift to be able to experience this. It's not every soul gets the opportunity to manifest in this way. And so, how can we honor that gift? I guess that's a why I have. I'm not sure I have an answer, but that's the one I keep.
So book number 10. The Man in the Sycamore Tree, The Good Times and Hard Life of Thomas Merton by Edward Rice, published in 1970.
Yeah, that one almost didn't make the list, but I think it did it to honor Merton. And because that book did have a real impact on me. It was a gift from my brother when it came out. And Merton I don't think about him as often as I did, but I go back to him every once in a while. And to me, Merton was one of those rare people who was a hermit, lived in a little cabin in Kentucky in the woods at the monastery at Gethsemane, but was incredibly aware of the world and engaged with the world. And to me, that's a lesson. As the Sufis say, to be in the world, but not of the world. Mm-hmm. I mean, he knew exactly what was going on, and he engaged in social issues, and he paid attention to popular culture. I mean, he listened to the Beatles as quickly as they released stuff, and he wrote about it. So he knew he was engaged. He just wasn't in it. He just had taken this vow of silence as a Trappist, and eventually was given permission to live on his own as a hermit, which is pretty rare in those communities. There aren't many people allowed to be hermits. And in that life was incredibly joyful from all accounts. And I've known people that knew him, and I've certainly read things that he's written. And yet also it was really hard. It took him years to convince his superior to allow him to move to the hermitage, to build it and to live in it. And he had an incredibly difficult time getting his writing approved so that it could go out into the world. So it wasn't an easy, I think people sometimes think, oh, these religious figures, they just, they don't have to worry about bills. And then they have other things that are challenging. Nothing's a cakewalk. But again, it goes back to, for me, an example of how one can live outside of the ordinary expected pathways and find peace and joy. And I hope he found ecstasy, because I think that's an essential human experience. So when I was thinking of the books, I thought, yeah, that book, Merton's writing certainly had an influence on me, and not so much Seven Storey Mountain, which I think I read a couple times, but his poetry and his letters that he wrote and his commentary. I had a course once with a nun who was a poet and a very good friend of his, and I just audited the course because the course was just her reading Thomas Merton's letters to her. that was the course.
Hmm.
So we go in every week, and he'd have written her a long letter, and she'd read the letter. It was a joy.
Well, that's, your 10 books, and you've lived many lives, across faiths, cultures, systems. Let's turn now from the books that shaped you to the life they helped you shape. So I have some questions for you. You once trained for the priesthood, then you became a diplomat, and now you work as a bridge between traditions. What threads connect those identities? And when did you realize that peace was your true vocation?
I think, well, the threads, there are a couple of themes. One is how do people communicate? I mean, I first trained as a therapist and worked as a therapist and counselor for about 7 years. And then I wanted to learn more about how does a culture enshrine values? How does a culture communicate ritually? So I studied law, which is really just that. When you go to a lawyer when you have to communicate and you can't, it's all lawyers are, ritual communicators within a very defined system. I didn't expect to practice law. I just wanted to learn the system. I just wanted to learn the language and the analytical process. I mean, I did eventually was a trial lawyer, and that was just theater. I mean, that's just, you put on a play and you hope your audience believes your version. It's performance. It's great.
Yeah.
So, and that was one, I would say there's sort of three threads, that the challenge of communication. And then as a diplomat, that's what you do. You communicate across cultures. At least that's what I did. I didn't do country to country diplomacy. I did people to people. And that was one of the other threads. I remember the first time when I was about 14, I was in the seminary library, and I ran across or was introduced to the idea of culture. And culture fascinates me as a filter, as how it shapes our perception. And so I've spent a lifetime in different ways trying to understand the limits of culture and also the freedom. I mean, just trying to understand what that means. And so that's why I said I did that long 10-year sort of exploration of American culture that took me to Basque festivals for the shepherds and Japanese community festivals. And I mean, it just wherever I could find people gathering and celebrating or just working in jobs that I thought would be. I worked as a merchant seaman. I worked on the railroad. I worked in the foundry. I did construction and demolition work. I mean, so sort of culture and communications. And then what is spirituality? I mean, I was drawn to it as a child, which is why I wound up in the seminary. But that was too limited. It just didn't celebrate. It didn't seem to me to celebrate life. It denied too much of life. There was an old, I can't remember who I heard it from, but a Sufi expression. It said, Sufi teachers, they're married and they eat meat, They're in the world. And then I realized that, Sufism is a path, and it's a good path for me, but if it's not anybody else's path, that's fine too. What I've realized is that everybody, we each have our own path, which is really challenging, but liberating at the same time. So those are sort of the themes that I've kind of stuck to, with a lot of meandering and a long misspent youth and a lot of misdirection and going down blind alleys. But I keep coming back to those themes. Now, peace, I mean, I think I was first certainly introduced to the idea of peace as within the Catholic tradition, which when I was young was going through a huge transformation coming out of Vatican II. And there was this opening up that was unimaginable. Everything changed. The rituals changed. The language changed. I mean, it was an explosion. And then peace became a very big part of that. And part of that was the peace of Martin Luther King and the peace of the civil rights movement, as opposed to the more, let's say, less peaceful defensive postures of someone like Malcolm X initially, or the Black Panthers. There was this belief in the power of peace. It wasn't passive, it was active. And then the peace movement against the Vietnam War, I was young, I was affected by it, I was involved with it as a kid, really. So that stayed with me. And later I think through diplomacy, through being exposed to not just the different cultures and the different places I've lived, but also the cost of violence. I mean, I've worked in places where there was either had recently been a war or there was a war, and you realize how sad, how tragic, and how absolutely useless. One of my teachers, a man named Bien Bior Shamshir, he was an incredible teacher, and he said World War II is necessary. At that point, there were Nazism, that ideology, the only way it could have been defeated was through a war. And he played a really interesting and exciting role in that war, which I won't go into now. But he said, but we're past that. He said the human experience now is so shared that we no longer need to see each other as the other, that war serves no purpose. And he said also, we're at a point where we have the choice. We could end our existence as a species, or we can evolve to the point where all human differences and disagreements can be solved peacefully, because the human experience is common enough. Now, that has only increased with the internet. I mean, I was thinking before we started how I was in India in the early 80s, and I've been back to India many times, and I was back 2 years ago, and it's not the same place. India looks a lot more like the rest of the world than it did in the 80s. Now, it's lost some of the color. It's lost some of what to me was so charming. And when I worked in Delhi in the mid-80s, I saw elephants on the street all the time, and an elephant that lived down the road. It's just not, there are almost no elephants left. You used to see long trains of bullock carts coming in every morning, bringing in produce. That doesn't happen anymore. But it's much easier to resolve difficulties because our experience is much more common. So as I sort of, I think, began to understand that more as I traveled, I realized that peace is the need of the moment, especially now with it's so, we keep repeating these things. Someone said karma is just doing the same thing over and over without learning from it. Seems to be that after major wars, about 80 years after, when the veterans are dying out and the memories of the horror are fading, we seem to be willing to do it again. And we seem to be approaching that moment, except for this time, there's no way out, that there's no limits, as there were no limits the last time we tried this madness. We won't be the first species that ends its existence. We'll just be the first ones who are responsible. So to me, peace is a prerequisite for everything. If you want to solve the climate crisis, you have to have peace. Just look at what the war in the Ukraine has done now, where everybody's going, energy security, we have to pump more energy. It's just an excuse. But yeah, to me, I think in the last 5 years, peace has become the most important thing for me to contribute to it.
Mm. What have you learned about the difference between making peace on paper and embodying peace in spirit?
I mean, I know a lot of people say we have to do one before you can do the other. I'd say no. I mean, and the violence. I mean, I was involved in the Good Friday Agreement. Fully, I was there. I mean, I always like to say I had a ringside seat, I had a front row seat. It ended the violence. It didn't resolve the differences. I mean, I was in Belfast not long ago, and yeah, they're still painting the murals. They're still painting the curbs. But they haven't killed anybody in 25 years. And that has opened the space for them to begin to resolve the conflict. I mean, one of the people I interviewed for a series of videos we're working on about peace in Northern Ireland is a is a Protestant Gaelic teacher. She said, if I did this 25 years ago, I'd be dead. So peace to me is it's not the absence of conflict, it's the absence of violence. Now, can you do that if you're not a fully aware human being? Yeah, let's hope, because there aren't many of us that can make that claim. If we all waited for us to find internal peace, God help us. So I believe that one should develop that sense of inner peace. It's the natural state. I mean, I walk in the woods or try to walk in the woods every day, and I'm aware of peace as the natural state. Every tree has lived its life because of peace. Though I'm often reminded by those nearest and dearest to me that I'm not always the most peaceful person. And how can I be out promoting peace when I haven't obviously developed deep peace within myself every moment of the day? Well, it's because like I said, if I waited for that, I probably wouldn't make much contribution. Not to say it's not important. I think that attempt at understanding myself, which is really spiritual growth, is important, and that gives me the strength and the focus and what little insight I may have. But if I waited for, as one of my teachers said, if I waited for rainbows in my chakras before I did anything, I'd be waiting a long time. Still hasn't happened.
As somebody who's been very much involved in many conflicts, and what do you think is going to happen in the Middle East? Do you think that they will find a way to at least stop the violence?
I pray for that every day. I mean, I don't know. There are too many memories. It goes back to what I said earlier. You have to just forget some things. And that will take a change in consciousness. It will take a change in culture, which is perception and how things are perceived. Until people realize, this is just my opinion, that the health and well-being and life of their children for the next 7 generations is more important than what might have happened 2 generations ago, or what might have happened 2,000 years ago. I mean, Joseph Campbell writes about it much more eloquently than I could ever paraphrase it, but some of these myths served a purpose at a time. Adhering to them and acting as if they were set in stone or literal just prevents us from providing for the future generations. Yeah. And that 7th generation is not for me. That's a Native American. That's how they see the world. We have to think 7 generations ahead. Well, for peace in the Middle East, people have to think 1 generation, and they have, I think, accept that you want to exemplify the values of a culture, and that doesn't necessarily mean it has to be a nation, if you know what I mean. That the values should be more important than the flag or the identity. And the values are all there, just that we seem to...
Yeah, it just talk about not understanding the book, the one where, was it the Pawnee speak only, in verbs. The thing that I can never get my head around is that at the core, we're all the same. We all want the same things. We want the same things for our children. Why do we lose sight of that and think sometimes the only way we can have that is to take that away from other people?
Oh, fear of change. A sense that somehow our identity is tied to that particular definition of our community. I mean, it's forgetting. It's letting go, which is what we have to do individually. Any mystical tradition is the constant dissolving of the personality. Well, that's what cultures have to do. They have to say, okay, that's who we were, or that's who we think we were, because we never really know who we were. But now who can we become as opposed to who we think we were?
Yes.
And stop thinking about a golden age. There never was a golden age for anybody at any time. I mean, there's this constant, whether it's America right now wanting to go back to the 1950s or Islam wanting to go back to the century after the death of the prophet, or everybody's got their golden age. Give it a rest. There was no golden age. This is as good as it's ever been. There's less poverty. There's better health. There's better nutrition than any time in remembered or recorded human history. Spear of Eliot said, I don't know why everybody's just not dancing with joy from the experience of being alive. And so I think, we need more joy. We need more celebration and less. And as you say, everybody wants the same thing, or at least they think they do, but then at times they don't. This goes back to culture. Not every culture. I think in our essence, yes, but often the cultural filters prevent us from experiencing the essence. And the most dramatic example would be, we're all the same. Well, no, we're not. I mean, the Pashtuns use their daughters to pay their debts. That's not the same culture as the one I live in. It's not the same. There are different values. Are those values transitive? Yes. Are they not transitive? Are they transitory? Yes, they change. But you have to, I would say, consciously participate in that change, because they're going to change anyway.
Mm-hmm. So what is the next frontier for enacting peace and for you personally?
Well, I think for enacting peace, we just want to continue to invite people to act for peace 4 times a year. This is a simple concept. It's on the solstices and equinoxes, act for peace. Now, what does that mean? Well, you could bake cookies. You could put a candle in the window. You could organize a concert for, 10,000 people. But act for peace so that it's not passive. So that I believe that peace exists because we all unconsciously or consciously want it, hope for it. It's the natural state, but it continues if we act for it. And it's not the result of the decisions of politicians or influencers or whoever, tech billionaires. It's the actions that we each take every day. I mean, I'm always struck when I drive from my house or walk, to the grocery store. Well, nobody runs me over. People obey the law. People are pleasant in the grocery store. That's peace. That's peace. That's people consciously expecting peace and acting on it. All of us, I think, most of us get up in the morning and we expect the day to end and we'll be back in our beds with the people that we love, and our house will be there and the beds will be there. That's not true for everybody. It's true for everybody if we expect it and act for it. And again, this goes back to what Shamsher said. The decision whether or not we continue as a species, whether we continue to grow together or grow apart, is not, again, he taught me that. It's not made by the decisions of politicians or people in power. It's each one of us individually choosing peace. So enacting peace, I just want to continue to invite people, act for peace 4 times a year. It's not asking too much, I don't think.
No, it's not. So, final question. Steve Jobs famously gifted all of the attendees at his memorial service with a copy of Autobiography of a Yogi. What book would you like to gift to the people who attend your memorial service?
I think the complete sayings of Hazrat. I mean, I was tempted to say the Essential Rumi because I think it's just so beautiful. But having spent close to a lifetime just going back to that book, and it's simple. It's, as Hazrat Inayat Khan said, the truths are simple, but people like things to be complex, so they make them much more complex than they need to be. One of the mistakes we make is we confuse simple with easy. But my experience is those things that are really important, really provide insight into the mysteries, God, truth, and everything, are simple. They're just not easy.
Michael Macy, thank you for adding your 10 best list of most influential books to the No BS Spiritual Book Club's library of recommendations.
Sandie, thanks very much. You've been way too patient with my ramblings.
No, I've enjoyed every minute of it. I have a few words to say to our viewers before we go. So, Michael Macy's words and journey remind us that enlightenment isn't found in isolation or in ideology. It's discovered in the quiet moments when courage and compassion outgrow belief. So consider this. Every time you choose curiosity over certainty or understanding over judgment, you're enacting peace. And that perhaps is the real holy work of our time. Peace is not easy, but it is possible if we act together. Michael and his colleagues at enactingpeace.org invite you to act for peace 4 times a year. That's it for this week. I'm Sandie Sedgbeer. I'll be back next week with another 10 best interview for the No BS Spiritual Book Club. Till then, it's goodbye from me and a massive thank you to Michael Macy.
If today's conversation sparked your curiosity, you'll love our other shows. The Synergy Sessions, where leading-edge thinkers collide in bold, unscripted dialogues that ignite new possibilities between realms and reason, where we journey into the mysterious consciousness, energy, and the hidden layers of reality, where science converges with spirit in ways you've never imagined. And the No BS Spiritual Book Club, where leading-edge new thought speakers, teachers, authors, and luminaries who've walked this path before you share the 10 books that had the biggest impact on their life journey. All 3 shows are available on YouTube, Spotify, Substack, and all major podcast platforms. For more information, visit sedgbeer.com. That's SEDGBEER.com.